Let's begin with the obvious, the elephant in the room, if we may. You've been reluctant today to talk about the takeover approach from Pfizer. Why?
Well, we just never comment on rumours around M&A. You know, if we commented on this one, we'd have to comment on every one. So, no comment.
The question, as you must understand, cuts to the heart of why shareholders are variously frustrated, displeased perhaps, with GlaxoSmithKline, and that has to do with the stock price. If a Pfizer or another company were to come to you with an offer that represented a premium of 20 to 25% over your current stock price, how could you turn that down?
Well, again, I'm not going to comment on all the rumours that have flown around over the last few days.
No, this is more a hypothetical.
As a general hypothetical point, obviously, we're always focused on trying to deliver the best returns possible for our shareholders over the short, medium and long run. Now, what you've got to recognise in a company like GSK is you have a lot of moving parts over time. We've just been through a prolonged period where we've had, let's call it our older generation of medicines go off patent. That's been a significant headwind. You know, it's frustrating for us, but it has to happen. It's like, you know, night follows day. Those things go through, you innovate, eventually you have to replace that generation of products. What we've been focused on over that period is building the platforms for growth to take us forward for the next 10 or 15 years. That's why we did the transaction with Novartis to build a world-leading consumer healthcare company, a world-leading vaccine company, and what we've announced today here in New York is, I believe, an innovation portfolio from our pharmaceutical and vaccine R&D, which is going to drive our pharma business forward over the next decade. That's what we're focused on executing. We think that is a great strategy for our shareholders. We think it can deliver real value. And, importantly, it allows us to build organically, not to commit enormous amounts of capital to buying other businesses, which has meant we've been able to give a very significant amount back to our shareholders. So I understand people focus on the share price, but they shouldn't forget the £35 billion we've paid back to shareholders over the last 7 years.
Now, companies like Pfizer say that they're at a competitive disadvantage having to pay U.S. tax. If Pfizer and Allergan do go ahead and agree to a deal at some point and Pfizer becomes a foreign domiciled company, do you think that makes them a greater competitive threat to you?
I'm not sure it really does. I mean, we're a UK domiciled company, so, but ultimately we pay our taxes in where we make our profits around the world. So we as a company pay about 20% tax in terms of our global business. We think, well, first of all, we think that's pretty competitive. It's come down a bit over the last few years. I actually think there's quite a big issue here as well about companies playing their role in society. Companies should pay some tax. I don't think you should be in a world where companies don't pay any tax. We're all part of the same society. So we think there's a balance point here as a first statement. Secondly, in terms of competition, we tend to compete. We don't compete with one company. It's not like one big company we worry about. We compete with a company in HIV. We compete with a different company in respiratory, a different company in rare diseases. It's really about who is the molecule competitor. It's less important to us in terms of whether there's one big company there. And finally, if we look over the last 15 or 20 years, the history of very big mergers in this business is mixed. I mean, some have been extremely successful. Others have not ultimately led to sustained holding of long-term market share gains. You know, they've kind of grown a bit and then they've receded. We have to see how all these things play out.
That reminds me, Andrew, of some of the skepticism, perhaps even criticism, that you've brought to this notion that acquisitions can be a survival strategy in your industry. What does Valeant say about companies that rely heavily on M&A?
Well, again, I don't want to get into a specific conversation about another company in the sector. I've always had a very strong belief that ultimately the pharmaceutical business is about innovation. You have to, and if you're going to innovate, you have to invest in it. If you want to have superior returns, and the drug industry has always been the beneficiary, and I think should be the beneficiary, of good margins. But if you want good margins, you need to take risk. And if you're going to take risk, that means R&D. R&D is difficult. We spent today with some of our best scientists. These guys have been advised by Nobel Prize winners. They're doing amazing things that very few people in the world can even conceptually understand what it is they're doing. They do that, and they may or may not succeed, and you will not know whether they are going to succeed for maybe 10 or 20 years. And in the process, you're going to spend $1 billion. That's a risky business. But in return, we get a pretty reasonable margin. We're allowed to earn that margin. I think when people start to say, hey, I want the margin, but I'm not going to take any of the risk, or I'm not going to invest in the research risk that underpins that margin in the business model, that's not sustainable.
Now, drug pricing has been a major issue in the U.S. in recent months, and it's even become a political issue with the presidential campaigns coming up. Curious how you see what's been going on lately with drug pricing as potentially impacting your ability to price drugs going forward in the U.S.
Well, I think, I've been on the record pretty widely for the last few years saying that I think we really need to think hard about where is this pricing debate going. I mean, on the one hand, drugs remain a small fraction of total healthcare cost here in the US. Only about 10% of total healthcare cost is the pharmaceutical business. But everybody's talking about drug pricing. Why is that? Well, first of all, there's no transparency. There's no transparency between the list price that everybody talks about and what actually is being paid. There are enormous discounts. Even the federal government, Medicaid, gets a mandated 23.8% discount. So the government only pays about 76% of the list price before it starts, and all of the other pays in the system are the same. If you look at my company, our price inflation at the net level over the last 5 years has averaged around 2%. So we've had about a 2% increase at the net price level in the US. In the rest of the world, it's been 0 to a little bit down. So we've got to get some sensible discussion about the facts. We've got to get a little bit more transparency in here. Personally, I think it's time that frankly, sensible people from all sides of the conversation start to get together and think about how do we evolve this. Because what we all want, certainly what I want, is I want us to see great medicines being made available to the people who need them, regardless of their income or insurance status. We've got to find a way to solve that. At the same time, we need to make sure the incentive for innovation remains. There's no point making everything zero price and then in 10 years we all say, where's the treatment for Alzheimer's? Because there won't be one if there's no incentive. On the other hand, if the new medicines are ultimately unaffordable for the average person, that's not a great outcome either. So we've got to focus on innovation and access in the same conversation. I think it is time for that kind of conversation to move forward.
There's only one way, though, to bring access. Somebody has to pay for it. It's either your shareholders, the government, or other premium payers in the insurance scheme.
Yes and no. I mean, somebody has to pay for it. Of course, that's obviously true. I think you have to just step back a little bit and you have to start to think about what's important to a company. What's important to a company is returns. We need returns. Now, returns are a function not just of price. They're a function of price and volume and, of course, your costs. If you think about the modern healthcare industry, not just the drug industry, but the modern healthcare industry, it's essentially dominated by the markets in the Western European countries and America. About 700 million people in the world, more or less, underpin what we would all regard as the modern healthcare industry. Actually, there are 7 billion people in the world. So the opportunity for volume to be developed, now it's obvious that that volume cannot be at the same price as the developed world, but it can be at some price. It can be at some level, at some margin, which starts to build into your overall return mix. It's all about area under the curve. This conversation gets too fixated on one axis, just the price. If we think about the area under the curve, you start to create a different solution space. Now, at GSK, what we've tried to do is say, look, strategically, let's engage with that concept. What does that mean? It means build the world's leading vaccine business. Average price point, $10 or $15 per vaccine globally, but we sell a billion units of vaccine around the world, almost to every country on the planet. Some of our biggest volumes go to the poorest countries in the world. They don't pay very much, but they make some contribution. Our consumer business, world-leading consumer healthcare company, again, it's an area where huge numbers of hundreds of millions of people are accessing our medicines or consumer healthcare products at lower prices, and then the pharmaceutical business. You add those three businesses together, what you're seeing is a whole series of contributions to the returns, which starts to take the pressure off the need to have the highest price. We think that is a very tenable, sustainable, long-term strategy. It depends on innovation, it depends on focusing on access, and it depends on accessing that broader volume.
So you've been in this role for 7 years. How much longer do you see yourself at the helm and running the transformation of GlaxoSmithKline?
Well, it's been a terrific place to be. I've been in the company for 30 years now, in fact. As you say, I'm in my 8th year now as CEO. It's kind of like dog years sometimes. We've done a lot. A lot has changed in the company. I've got to tell you, today was one of the proudest days for me because we embarked back in 2008 on a reinvention of our discovery organisation. And we said at the time, you know, discovery is a 7 to 15-year cycle thing. It's going to take 7 or 8 years before we see if this works. And it was incredibly good, A, to stand up there with the 2 people who began that journey with me, Patrick Vallance and Monsef Slaoui, the 2 heads of our global R&D businesses, along with all of their lead scientists, kind of showcasing all of this innovation. 80% of the 40 drugs and vaccines we showed today were first-in-class. 80%. First-in-class medicines. We were talking about curing diseases. We're talking about aspiring to give people lifetime protection against dangerous disease. We still have a lot of work to do to get that done. I'm looking forward to seeing it finished.